Thank you very much for this opportunity. This is a great pleasure to be out here, mainly because it's cold and miserable and raining in Ontario right now. But, I met a lot of people here, and I've talked to a lot, and I've been really impressed with all the presentations, and there's an awful lot of integrity and an awful lot of credential in this room. And I wanted to qualify mine because, I started out in life as a commercial photographer and got into conservation 25 years ago. And I don't have the degrees, I don't have the experience, I just have a lot of hard knock school of learning. So, to give you an example of that, years ago I did a presentation in Boise, Idaho at the North American Ornithological Union, and after the presentation this gentleman introduced himself, and he was about 85 years old, and he was a professor emeritus at one of the Western universities. And just an incredible character. He'd studied bird flight all his life. And I felt kind of funny, because here's this credentialed man with all his experience, and I've flown along with a Canada goose right here, and my finger's on its back, and I felt odd about that. So he was telling me about his Asia trip and everything else, and he'd been traveling all over the world. And I wanted to ask him how long he'd been back in the US, and for some reason I was going to use the expression, how long he'd been in country. But based on his travels and experience, I thought I'd expand my comment. Without further thought, I asked him how long he'd been incontinent. Intelligence is relative. Anyway, I'm going to give you a little history of Operation Migration and our work with whooping cranes and how it all ties in. So, whooping cranes are an ancient species. They've been around for years, many years, in fact, about 60 million. They're one of the older bird species, and they've evolved into 15 species worldwide, 11 of which are either endangered or threatened. And in North America, we have two. We have the most common, which is the Sandhill crane. I'm sure you've got lots of them around here. I've seen great pictures. And we also have whooping cranes, which is by far the most endangered. Odd that we have both ends of the bracket, but I don't know if I can make this work. No, I can't, sorry. We had a little incident just before this, trying to get all this stuff working together, and we barely escaped, thanks to the great technician here that helped us out. Anyway, I was going to play a whooping crane recording, but I can't do that. Whooping cranes are named because they have an 8-foot trachea, and you can hear their call for about 2 miles. It's a long distance thing. It's just an incredible call. We've been really struggling here trying to get this show to work. Ah, there it is. The only extant population of whooping cranes nests in Wood Buffalo National Park in the northern part of this province, and they travel 2,500 miles down to the Aransas National Wildlife Refuge in Texas. And that population was once down to 16 individuals. That was the low count. That's all the whooping cranes that existed in the world. We're up now to almost 700 if you include all the populations and the birds in captivity, but it's still a critically endangered species. This is Wood Buffalo National Park. I don't know if you've been up there. It's just an incredible place. It's like 11 million acres. It's bigger than Switzerland. It's just the perfect habitat for whooping cranes. And it was probably fringe habitat back when, when whooping cranes were nesting all over North America. But because it's so isolated, it's kind of allowed the species to survive. And back in 1975, they collected eggs from wood buffalo and started a captive flock in Maryland, the Patuxent Wildlife Research Center. So there's a bunch of problems with having all of your birds in one flock. Of course, you have a high risk of extinction. You can have a chemical spill in Texas at their wintering grounds. You could have an avian disease, and you could lose the entire population. So the whole idea was to establish other populations. That's difficult. Whooping cranes learned to migrate by following the parent generation, and they were all wiped out. The last birds to nest in the US was in 1878. So it's difficult. We had to figure out how that was even possible. Whooping cranes don't breed until they're about 5 years old, so if you try something, it takes 5 years before you can even do an evaluation. So it's a long and difficult process. So the first experiment to see if this would work took place in Grays Lake, Idaho. where they had this clever idea. They would take whooping crane eggs out of Wood Buffalo Park and they'd place them in sandhill crane nests in Grace Lake and hope the sandhills would teach them how to be wild birds and how to migrate. And it all worked, except that 5 years later, those birds wanted to breed with sandhills. So their cross-fostering project turned into a cross-imprinting project, and so the whole thing had to be stopped. In fact, we ended up with, it was probably the greatest ugly duckling story, the real-life ugly duckling story, but we ended up with a couple of whoop hills, which are across, fortunately they can't breed, so they're kind of like, is it donkeys or mules? Which one? One of those two can't breed. So with no method of making this bird migratory and all these propagation centers producing chicks for release, they decided to start a non-migratory flock in Florida. So that's the Kissimmee Prairie of Florida. And for a number of years, starting in 1993, they released birds in that area, hoping to build the population up. Unfortunately, their time span worked exactly in the 10-year drought that Florida had. And so a lot of the habitat was dried up, and the birds were left to be predated. And also, there was a boom in the housing, the market, in the land market in Florida at that time. And so a lot of that habitat was bought up and developed, and that population didn't work. In fact, the last birds from that flock were just recently moved over to Louisiana to join another flock over there. So that was 2 failed efforts. Now, mind you, we learned a lot during each one of those ongoing projects, and so that kind of set the ground for us to try ours. And it began in 1993 when we led the first flock of Canada geese south. And then we worked at various experiments with sandhill cranes and trumpeter swans before we finally convinced the Fish and Wildlife Service that this was a good idea. Now, you got to understand, my partner, Bill Lishman, was the first person to fly with birds ever, and that was back in 1988. And he crashed a bunch of airplanes and broke his foot, but he eventually was able to do that. And then I joined him in 1993 and did the very first migration. We led birds from Ontario down to Virginia. And so Bill was a metal sculptor, I was a commercial photographer, and here we were asking the US Fish and Wildlife Service to give us their most endangered species so we could dress up in costume and lead them halfway across the country in an aircraft that's made of the same material as lawn chairs. So it was a tough sell. In fact, the fact the birds came back, to me, is not near as surprising as the fact that we were able to sell it to the US Fish and Wildlife Service, but we did. One of the things we learned early on, this is the Canada goose, one of the things we learned early on is you should never, ever fly directly behind a Canada goose. Unless you're wearing a full-face helmet. In fact, that's Bill Lishman. That was one of his flights when he took off with the birds. There's so many stories I could tell you about flying with Canada geese. It was just so much fun. One time, we'd take the birds off and we'd fly around during the training, and build up their endurance before we started a migration. So I'm flying along, and there's a wedding going on. And so I fly right over the wedding. Everybody comes bailing out of the church. They're ignoring the wedding and ignoring the bride and groom, and they're all waving at the airplane as the goose flies around. All these birds fly around in a circle. And we had some Canada geese that I think were afraid of heights. I'm not sure why that was, but they just wouldn't climb. You get them up to 200 or 300 feet, and they go right down on a deck again. And so back then we weren't using costumes, and we could talk to the birds, and we used to say, "Come on, geese, come on, geese." But sometimes I used 4-letter words when they wouldn't climb. And so here I am yelling at these birds, and the next day I'm walking through my hometown, and I come across this woman I know, and she's a big supporter, and she says, "I saw you flying yesterday." And I said, "Oh, great, that's terrific." And she says, "What were you yelling at those birds?" I had no idea they could hear me on the ground there, and I'm cursing halfway across the countryside with these birds following me. We decided that during the early training, when they're chicks, it was really tough to have the aircraft there because they could run underneath the wheels or in front of the prop, and you can make goose soup pretty quickly that way. So we decided to push it around. Well, it's very difficult to push that thing up and down the runway to get the birds to follow it. So it's a lot of work. So So we built what we called the goose toddler, and this was the dummy of the aircraft, and it was an idea to get them imprinted on the aircraft. Now, this is something that you kind of want to do in the privacy of your own backyard. You know? It's not something that you want to show in public, and I used this photograph because if I didn't, Bill would have used it. So that's me at a younger age with my little goose toddler. It looks like something on a Monty Python, but it did work. So when we finally started working with cranes, we began working with the Patuxent Wildlife Research Center in Maryland. That's the U.S. Geological Survey between Washington and Baltimore, and they have the largest captive flock of whooping cranes. They have about 77 birds, I think 40 pairs, 30 pairs, and they produce all the chicks that we use for release. Whooping cranes will generally lay 2 eggs, and if they're taken by a predator early in the incubation, they'll lay 2 more. So with timing and practice, you can get about 10 eggs out of a pair of whooping cranes. And that's how we produce the birds for release. They're hatched in incubators and then moved to a brooder. This is when they first begin to hatch. That's called pipping, when they punch a hole in the egg and before it opens up. And we used to play a recording of the aircraft to them at that point. And we'd also play a recording of the brood call, which is what the parent issues to the chick. That's when they start to communicate. And that's a big part of the imprinting process. We didn't want to repeat the problems of Gray's Lake, so we introduced adult sexual imprint models. That's the adults that are next to the chick, and they're divided by a plexiglass wall, but that was the idea, that they'd grow up and be attracted to the right species. And so it's funny because the adults would often try to feed the chicks through that plexiglass. Sorry, I keep having to turn around. I was hoping to have my monitor here. We got involved in isolation or costume rearing. I'm sure you've all heard of that. The idea was not really to look like a crane. It was more to disguise the human shape. And it went beyond just wearing the costume. You weren't allowed to talk. You weren't allowed to carry tools or cameras in front of the birds. You had to act more like a bird. We carried a puppet that looked like an adult. And the whole idea was just to remove that human shape so that once the birds were released, they weren't familiar with that shape. We can't make them wild or tamed. They're kind of born neutral, and they learn everything from the parent by watching the parent and how they behave. And so we had to just remove everything that was human from their experience. And once they're released in the wild, their natural fear of the unknown would take over. So they never saw cars or buildings or bicycles or heard voices or any of that stuff. So it was a very difficult protocol to follow. This is the team going down actually to do a vet check on the birds before they left on migration. And it's a very distinctive costume. You know, it looks like a cross between the KKK and a Teletubby. You gotta watch around daycare centers or Alabama. And of course, you have to be careful of the crew because God knows what they're going to get up with. We had a really strong connection with Disney's Animal Kingdom. We were recipients of the Disney's Animal Kingdom International Conservation Fund. And so they were a big help. Also, their vet team looked after all of our birds once we were in the southern half of the migration. So this is a kind of a combination of the mouse and a crane. And of course, Halloween was a big time for us. And so we were driving through Indiana one time, and we saw this display in somebody's front yard. So 2 of the kids jumped out, donned their costumes. And of course, while they were doing this, I was across the street with my long lens taking pictures. And a little old lady came out of the house, you know, that doorway, and walked in front of them. And she was about, 5 foot nothing, and she was about 85 years old. And so the guys didn't want to move because they thought they'd give her a heart attack. So they just stood there, and she walked right by and down the street, and she was gone. Never noticed them. So back in the truck and they went. This is working with chicks when they're very young. Whooping cranes, as I said, will lay 2 eggs. Usually, sometimes both of them hatch. And if they do, there's a high case of siblicide. That usually the bigger one will push the other one out, and usually only one survives. So when you work with them in the field, you have to do it individually, otherwise they want to kill each other. can hardly walk and they want to kill each other. So you work with the birds individually, and then as their personalities change, they'll learn to acclimate, and then you can start to build them into larger groups. So we start our acclimation and the imprinting process in Patuxent in Maryland. And we had a circle pen, which is about 10 meters across, half a meter high. We put the chicks on the inside, that way they're protected. And then the aircraft on the outside, and we had what we called a robo-crane, which is that big long crane, and we could pull a trigger and it would dispense mealworms. And then the chicks would go to investigate the mealworms, and we'd move the aircraft around, and eventually we got them to follow us around in that big circle, and that's how we really started to get the birds following us. Of course, whooping cranes, chicks have a very short attention span, so it wasn't easy. It was a slow process, and if we started with 20 chicks, we had to train them every day, and you couldn't do it when it was really hot in the afternoon. See, there's a bird with the same attention span as mine. But it was a tremendous amount of work. We would be working from sunrise to sunset every day, trying to get these birds ready to be transported out to Wisconsin. Balancing their growth, when they're that age, they grow about 1 inch a day, and they have these long legs. And if they get too fat or don't get enough exercise, they'll get what's called hawk rotation, where their legs will turn outbound and they can't walk. So we would put them in the pond and walk them, or the tub. And you can see here how imprinted that chick is on that head, that model. It's just incredible. They'll follow you anywhere. In fact, one time when we were working with Canada geese, we had a whole bunch of these little goslings on the grass, and it was a lovely sunny day, and they were all wandering around, and I was standing there, and somebody started a motorcycle, and it scared them all, and within a half a second, they were all over my feet. It looked like I had big yellow slippers. It just went right to the parent. They're really, really locked onto the parent. So when they were about 40 days of age, when their growth plates have closed and their blood feathers are kind of coming in, we would put them in closed containers, and we would put them in a van and drive them to the Baltimore airport. And then Terry Kohler of the Kohler family from Sheboygan manufacturing family, they make bathroom fixtures and all that stuff. Terry would loan his aircraft and his flight crew, and they would fly down to Baltimore the night before so the birds could be transported in the morning when it was cool, and move to Wisconsin. Over the course of that project, he did 32 trips like that, back and forth. So, hugely generous man and great supporter. We did the project at Necedah National Wildlife Refuge for the first 10 years, and as I said, it took 6 years before we produced the first chick. But then we discovered we had a problem there with black flies. I'm sure you're familiar with black flies. You know what they're like. Mosquitoes are one thing. If you're wearing a jacket, a mosquito can't bite you through that. But a black fly will attack you behind the ears and burrow into your hair, and they draw blood. And that bird was nesting and sitting on a nest, and all of a sudden it turns 70 degrees, and out come the black flies. Now, there's a patch of, there's a patch of bare skin up here they use for display. That's all black flies. And this is blood they've drawn to the surface. They're burrowing in. So what happens is the black flies were driving the birds off the nest. This has happened to American loons also in Wisconsin, where they have years where there is no production of loons because they're driven off the nest by black flies. And so, in fact, when they get driven off the nest, it doesn't take long before the ravens come in and steal the eggs or break the eggs. And we had one shell that the University of, I forget. Anyway, this university professor was counting our black flies for us, and there were 750 black flies in one shell. So it's a real pest for the birds. So we decided to move out of there and move to White River Marsh, which is about 60 miles east of there. And White River Marsh is operated by the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. And we had to start over again, basically, building up pens. And that's what it looked like when we first moved into White River Marsh. And there were all kinds of wetlands around there, but there's a high ridge there that we could actually use for a runway in our pens that was dry ground. So the first thing we had to do was put a road in, getting over the river and into the area where we could operate. And so we brought some heavy equipment in and we built ourselves a road. And then that night we had 5 inches of rain. That was the road when it was finished, and this is the road the day after. And so everything we did in that pen, we carried in. We had a whole team of volunteers and our crew, and we built this entire pen about a half a mile out into the marsh, all by carrying stuff out there and running generators. And so we built a 2-part, that big scrape at the top. We had a bulldozer scrape that out, and that was the wet pen. Whooping cranes roost in water at night, so that was the pen for them to roost in. And then this was what we call the dry pen. It's covered in sheet metal. It's driven into the ground 2 feet, so you can't get, digging predators can't get at it. It's protected by 3 strands of electric fence, and the whole thing was covered in a top net. And we had a live surveillance camera out there. And so we had to get that all done in about 2 weeks before the birds arrived from Patuxent. That's what it looked like from the air. We had our runway here. Whoops, sorry. Our runway here, this is the wet pen, this is the dry pen. Parking lot was way out here. This is the half a mile road out to the main road, and that was all closed. And out here is all marsh, and here we had an observation blind that we brought a lot of the public in. We had a large public audience that supported us. We had a live camera that people could go online with a password, and then they could drive the camera, they could pan, tilt, and zoom it. And so in the morning, we would arrive with the airplane, and they would track the entire training session up and down the runway. And then once we left, they could watch the birds, and it switched to infrared at night, so they could watch the birds at night. And quite often, you'd have people from Japan watching the birds and running the camera for us and looking at the deer across the street and all that. It was a pretty incredible camera system, because we were about 3 miles from the nearest power and about 7 miles from the nearest internet connection. So the whole thing was done with radio signal. It's a pretty amazing camera. It's close to Halloween, so I thought I'd include this shot. We used to put pumpkins as just to break the boredom of the birds in the pen. We'd put pumpkins in there. It's natural food. And so this is what they would do to a pumpkin. But I put one in there on Halloween, and that's what they did to it. I'm not sure if they were sending us a message. That was pretty scary. That wild. The Wisconsin DNR had this farm they bought. It was 125 acres, and it was pretty well played out, so they purchased it, and they were going to bulldoze it all and turn it into tall grass prairie. But they said, well, it's a good place for you guys to camp. So we had motorhomes and trailers, and we had power and water there, so we made it our camp. It worked out perfectly. But what they didn't tell us is the farmer still had rights to keep it as an active farm for the first year, and he had pigs. So these were our roommates for the first year. It smelled a bit funny, but it worked fine. And that's what the camp looked like after we'd been there for a few days. We had a team of about maybe 8 people working there all summer. You work 7 days a week, 12 hours a day, start way before sunrise. This is one of our first training sessions once we moved the birds. We left the wing off the aircraft because it's just too cumbersome to work with. But this always makes me wonder what those birds think those wings are for. Like, they've never flown with them. They have no idea. They probably have never seen an adult fly. It's just some big long appendage stuck out there, and it's got no fingers on it. You can't pick your nose with it. Like, it must be weird. I just can't imagine what it's like when they first get airborne and say, ah, that's what these are for. As I was saying, they grow about an inch a day at this rate, and their personalities change. There's a huge difference in the dominant structure within the flock, and each bird has an individual personality. We used to keep track of their dominant structure as it evolved over the course of the summer, and it was just a fascinating thing to watch. Whooping cranes have about 60 calls, displays, postures, or behaviors that we know the meaning of. And so you could walk into the pen and you could tell which bird was being subservient and which bird was hiding behind you because that one over there was picking on them, and which bird was in the corner kind of stalking you and trying to figure out where they belonged in the pecking order and whether they could take you or not. I always say it's kind of a lot like when you're in high school You know, when there's too few brain cells and too much testosterone, you know, and you have these little constant battles going on in the hallway. That's what it's like with whooping crans. They have that personality, and you get to know them, and it's kind of an honor to be, you know, in their company. It's like being invited into their culture. You know, you have to speak with a funny language, a funny accent, and you don't know all the rules. But it really was fascinating to watch. The second generation of birds that we would lead one generation down, and the next year we'd start a new one. And one year, the second generation were close by. They'd hang around the pen. And at one point, we had to cut the grass on the runway, and you can't do that with the birds there. You can't have the mowers working and all that stuff. So we would let the birds out midday, and then a couple of interns would lead them off into the marsh, maybe a half-mile back into the marsh, and they would probe in the mud all day, and the team would come in, do all the maintenance, cut grass cutting, and then we'd call them back. And I wanted to get some photographs of the birds in their natural environment, so I grabbed my camera, I covered it up and put my costume on and walked out to where they were in the marsh. And as I got there, one of the adult birds kind of came in and landed 100 feet from me. And he was walking towards the chicks, and they can be aggressive sometimes. You know, you can get these battles going on, they're territorial. So I didn't want him to go there, so I stepped in front of him. And the first part of it is the first challenge is he stands up tall. And I stand up tall, and we see who's taller in increments all the way up. And of course, you know, I had my puppet like this, and he's about that tall. And so I won that contest. So he walked around a little piece of brush, and tried to go another way. So I got in front of him, and he stamped his feet, and I stamped my feet. And then he fluffed himself all up to look big, and I fluffed myself all up. And they have this threat posture. It's called a stick toss. And it's kind of like you're so insignificant, I can turn my back on you, and I can play with this little stick down here. Of course, the whole time he's got his eye on me, you know? And there he is playing with his stick, pretending to ignore me, and I'm over here playing with my stick, pretending to ignore him, the two of us in the marsh. This went on for 45 minutes, you know? I knew what he was thinking, he knew what I was thinking. It was just an incredible experience for me, and hard to relate, but it's amazing if you put a costume on and stop talking and just listen, what you can learn about animals. It was a real opportunity to work closely with a species and get into its psyche as opposed to your own. They have all of these threat postures, and you can see that we're trying to chase these birds off the runway because the adults would come and land on the runway. We're trying to train. So we're taxing up the runway, and you can't go because there's an adult standing in your way, so we chase them off like we're supposed to do. And of course, they would threat posture. And this one you can tell is female, because that was the spring, and that's where the male stands on her back and tries to copulate. And so there's mud all over her, so you could tell she was female. It's about one of the only ways you can tell. They're just an amazing communication system without words. It's just incredible to watch. That's one of our chicks chasing an adult. One year we had a huge amount of rain in the spring, and when the birds arrived, even the wet pen, or the dry pen was full of water. And when they're that young, they can't stand up all day. So we would go out there 3 or 4 times a day and then walk them out onto the runway where there was a dry spot, and they would immediately lie down and have a little rest. And so we would just sit there for a half hour, 45 minutes, and the sun was out and the flowers were out. And there should have been music playing in the background. It was just way too cute. And so that adult was in the marsh, and it came walking out very quietly and sat down beside us. And that was one of the birds we trained the year before. It was pretty spectacular to watch. And so this went on for half an hour. Everybody's calm and resting, and then one of the chicks got up and walked over to that tall grass and was poking around. The adult picked his head up, gave a little chortle like a burp, and the chick perked up, turned around, walked back, and sat down. So I'm not sure what she said, but I wish I could speak that language. This is some of the early flight training when we first start flying with the birds. If you fly very close to the ground, it's easier. The drag is reduced, so it's much easier to fly. In fact, you ever see pelicans going across the water at the very surface? They're doing that because there's almost no drag. Everything that flies has drag, but when you get out close to the surface. So before our birds could even fly, they could fly the length of the runway. And so that's what we're doing there, just back and forth high-speed taxi runs. And that was all part of the process of fledging. It took them 80 days before they could take off and fly, before they developed the muscles and the feathers. And of course, they'd like to inspect the aircraft after. We spent a lot of time just And this is what it kind of looked like when we put the whole thing together. This was an early morning flight. When you first take off, the birds take 2 steps and they're airborne. The aircraft has to break friction with the ground, so it has to go 40 miles an hour to get airborne. And then as soon as we get the aircraft airborne, you slow it down as much as you possibly can so the birds can catch up. When you slow an aircraft down, it reaches a point where it stops being an airplane and turns into a Volkswagen. You know, it starts to fall. And so you have to be really careful because you're doing that about 10 feet over the marsh in the middle of nowhere. So we would fly circuits around that area, get the birds used to following us. You can see the crowd. We used to fly over that spot every day, and there'd always be a crowd there waiting for us. We would stop school buses sometimes. They would stop and pull over, and all the kids would get out and be late for school, and it was all our fault. And, we had a lot of fun with the birds, but it was a lot of work. You can see whooping cranes are soaring birds. They normally take off on a nice sunny day where there's lots of thermal activity, lots of cumulus clouds, and they would climb up, ride the cloud up, or the thermal up the same way a hawk or an eagle does, and then they would just glide to the next one, find that one, core up in that, and keep gliding, and they can cover maybe 400 miles in a day if the weather's good. We couldn't fly like that, of course. We would fly first thing in the morning when the air was dead calm, and as we plow through the air, it creates a vortices off each wingtip. It's like a wake on a boat, and our birds learned instinctively, just figured that out, that they could fly off that. They would just find that sweet spot. So the lead bird might be that far from your wingtip, just hovering on that spot right there. But occasionally, they would drop off. It's kind of like being the last skater in one of those lines of skaters when you spin them around in a circle and the last one goes flying off of the trees at 80 miles an hour. The same thing would happen if we hit a little wave. That last bird would get dropped off, and you could give up all your altitude and go down and chase it, or you could bring in the chase pilot. So we had multiple aircraft in the air that would pick up stragglers. In fact, we had one bird. It was about 2006, and I remember his number was number 10. And he figured out really early that if he took off with the aircraft and he couldn't get his way up to the front of the right behind the wingtip where it was really easy to fly, if he dropped out, another aircraft would come along and pick him up. And so that happened every time. And one day it was Richard Van Heuvelen's time to lead the birds, one of our pilots, and he took off, and there was a hill next to him, and the wind was just rolling over the hill, just enough to make it all bumpy and trashy, and of course the birds would turn around, and he was having a tough time, and number 10 dropped out. And so I moved in, picked up number 10, and because I had one bird on my wing, I could climb fairly easily. So I climbed up to 1,000 feet, and I headed on course. And up at 1,000 feet, there was a nice tailwind, so I was moving along pretty good, and then I thought, well, wait a minute, if I keep going, I'm gonna leave, if Richard doesn't get out of there with these birds, I'm gonna leave them all behind. I'll have one bird in the next bend. So I turned around. Well, you turn around, now you're facing into the wind. It's kind of like paddling upstream. And so I got to the point where I could just park the airplane. It was hovering in the air, perfectly, air was passing over the wing, it was flying, but I wasn't moving relative to the ground. And I had the bird on the wingtip and me, and we were just watching Richard back and forth, 1,000 feet below us, getting his butt kicked until he finally got up into the smooth air and joined us, and we took off. It was an interesting vantage point, just being parked in the air like a helicopter. Our migration route was between Wisconsin and Florida. That's 1,250 miles from White River Marsh to St. Mark's National Wildlife, just south of Tampa. As I said, the birds can do that in about maybe 2 weeks, maybe even a week if they get good weather. We couldn't do it in that short a time, so we had to have stopover sites about every 50 miles. And so we would take off right at sunrise when the air was calm and there was no wind, and we would fly about 38 miles an hour. That's what bird speed is. And so we could get maybe 50, maybe 100 miles if we got some calm air. So we had all these stopover sites all along the way. And then, of course, we had to have that approved by the FAA. They had to look at it. So this is an aviation chart with our migration route all around all of the important airport areas. And then, of course, the birds never fly the way they're supposed to. This is this is the track history on my GPS in the airplane. So one day we took off, and the birds had been down for 3 or 4 days on the migration. They hadn't flown because of the weather. So we took off, and of course they turned back to the pen. So you chase them, and you get them again. You take off, and this is my circuitous route. Took 45 minutes before they finally decided to follow the aircraft, and then we led them for another hour and a half before we got them to where we were going. This is our crew with all our motorhomes and trucks and trailers and vet teams, and there was about 12, sometimes 15 of us, fish and wildlife media people. And of course, you know, we would stop at private homes, you know, people who had cooperated to allow us to go there, you know. And I always say it was kind of like the world's worst mother-in-law story, you know, because they had no idea when we were going to get there. It was going to be some ridiculous hour first thing in the morning, and we were going to fill their backyard full of airplanes and their front yard full of motorhomes, and we were going to tap into their power, and their showers looked really good, and thanks for the internet connection, and the birds were penned in an isolated area on their property somewhere, but they couldn't go down there. And we had no idea when we were going to leave. It could be tomorrow, it could be 2 weeks from now, you know. So they were extremely generous people. We were very fortunate to know them all. Sometimes they would push their own airplanes out of their hangar to let us put our aircraft in. They just were amazing. We made some great friends. This was a house we stayed at in Tennessee. They weren't all dumps. That was a beautiful place. In Tennessee, the owner was a pilot, so he had a runway and a hangar, and he let us stay there, and it was just terrific. Other places, you know, we'd live in our motorhome for 2 weeks in the rain. This is a farmer that pushed his tractor out to let us put our aircraft in the. Our airplanes they weighed 400 pounds, and they weren't great in the weather outside. People were very generous. And after a while, it got to be that we became friends with a lot of them. So they'd invite their friends over and their family over, and we got to know them all, and we'd tell stories and have great times. And we were there for Thanksgiving, so people would buy, you know, invite us to dinner, and we had these great meals. It just was a terrific. In fact, at one point, I thought, well, why don't we just keep going? We'll go down to Florida, we'll go across to Texas, you know, up through New Mexico, and we'll just be like surfing bums. We'll be bird bums, you know, and eat pie all the way. That'd be great. They even let us use their office once in a while. This is a really bad image, but you can see what happens when a bird drops below the wing and has to flap its wings. You can see how hard that bird is working, and you can see in a second you'll see one that's dropped down behind even lower. And so I'm slowly moving down to help pick these birds up, and when they get right behind the wingtip, you'll see the difference. And then all of a sudden, you can see the wing beats reduce, and when the bird moves right up behind the wing, they'll all stop. And you can carry them like that. It's almost like a trailer. As long as the air is calm, you can carry them that way for an hour. It's fascinating to watch. Sometimes when one of the other pilots was leading, I would race ahead and land at our site. So it kind of gave the birds that familiar aircraft down there. They'd never landed there before, and so the aircraft on the ground gave them a familiar sight. So I'd be in my costume with my puppet calling them down, and they would all land around you. And it was such an amazing, these birds are 5 feet tall. They've got a 7-foot wingspan. And it's so incredible to stand in this field and watch these birds all around you. So I slowed it down just to enjoy the view. It's just an amazing thing to watch. They're huge. I mean, it's hard to relate in video. The unfortunate part is there's no medium to capture what it's really like to fly with birds. It's just such a beautiful scene. This is one of our travel pens. We made these trailers up that we could travel with, so that's where the birds were housed while we were on the migration. We could set them up in about 40 minutes. They had electric fence protected around the outside, feeding station and water and everything else. In fact, Jimmy Carter was a big supporter of ours, and he came out one time to watch the birds. He asked if he could come and see them land, and I said, well, yeah, if you hide, in the tree line and dress in camo, you can. So he and his wife showed up in camo with the Secret Service, and they hid in the trees, and we flew in, and then afterwards he said, well, I support Habitat for Humanity. I can build stuff. So he started building the pen for us. He was really terrific. The aircraft we flew were called trikes. I guess that's because they have 3 wheels and 2 seats and an engine at the back, but they have a wing like a hang glider, and they have a microphone on them, or a speaker on them that broadcasts that brood call, and so the birds are familiar with that. So that's one of the ways we get them to follow us. They have a king post out the top. That post that sticks out the top supports these wires, which holds the wing up on the ground. Between this triangulation, that's what supports the wing. And we killed several birds, 4 birds altogether. They were flying to that king post. They would get in front of the aircraft and get trapped. It was a bit scary. So finally, based on a donation by Disney, we were able to buy what are called topless wings that are strut-based. So we didn't have that wire above that, and it made a huge difference. And so after that, we never lost birds again to the top wire. We had one female bird that used to fly about 3 or 4 back in the line, and of course she had to flap her wings once in a while, and she kept wanting to get to the front where she could just glide. And she figured out that's the best way to do it, but she wasn't strong enough or aggressive enough to do that. So she would drop underneath the wing, and then she would fly beside me, working really hard, trying to pass the aircraft, and then go up on the top of the wing where all those flying wires were, and then slide down the leading edge of the wing and take the lead position, displace the lead bird that way. And it worked so perfectly for her, but it scared the hell out of me, with those birds in those wires, because we've killed birds that way. So as she would slide down the wing, when she got close to the end, I would push the wing up, and that would hit her feet, throw her center of gravity off, and she would dive about 20 feet. I would just tip her over. And I called it flipping the bird. But it did work. It did work. It deterred her, and she never did it again. So I think I saved her life. I'm not sure. The FAA made us get new aircraft. We were flying the ultralight type airplane, and they brought a new rule in the U.S. called light sport category. And so our airplanes didn't qualify anymore, and we were actually flying for hire. And you can't fly an ultralight for hire, so they made us buy new aircraft. So we started a Indiegogo fund and raised about $150,000 to buy the airplanes, and then got to use them once before they ended the study. But we do have an aircraft in the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. I have a brother who's lived his entire life, well, mostly in the Yukon, but now he lives in Edmonton. And he used to fight forest fires in a helicopter, and he retired with 30,000 hours of flying time. He's flying this $1 million machine, and here I am flying an ultralight. And we've always been rivals, and he's this expert pilot, and I'm a grassroots aviator, but I'm the one with the aircraft in the Smithsonian. So. He still doesn't like that. We also had one in Disney's Animal Kingdom for a long time because they were big supporters and actually partners in the program. And we have another one at the, just went up on display at the Experimental Aircraft Association in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. So that's kind of the trifecta of aviation museums. So we're really pleased about that. Oh, this is one day the birds broke up in the air, so we each picked a few up, and I had one bird. And I was ahead of everybody else, and so I came in for a landing, and the grass is very wet, and you can see this bird, you can see the shadow of it pass overhead in front of me. He lands right in front of me, and I hit the brakes. But in the last second, I pushed him out of the way, and I didn't know that camera was running. It was a GoPro, and it had been running for like an hour. And so I looked at it, and I thought, I got to slow that down. These legs are thin, and there's only 2 things in them. There's bone and artery. And if you break the bone, the bird generally bleeds out. They don't survive. So he came awfully close to that tire. This is one of our early morning takeoffs. We used to park the aircraft and there'd be ground crew there, and the pen is made of 10-foot panels. So we'd open up 2 of those panels, creating a 20-foot gap. And so the pilot would get in position, get ready, he would turn on his vocalizer, and then he would give the thumbs up, and the crew would open these 2 panels. And so there's this big 20-foot door, and off they go, and he times his takeoff perfectly, and the crew run along behind him to get excited. Of course, there's always one bird that can't find the door. And so, gotta get him out there. Now he's screaming and yelling to come back, wait for me, wait for me. And some of those birds, they don't like flying first thing in the morning, they'll turn back and head back to the pen. So the crew go in and they hide, so they aren't an attraction. And then we bring out what we call the swamp monster, which is a big plastic tarpaulin we put over ourselves. And the birds hate it, they won't land if that thing is there, they don't even know what it is. But it wanders around, so that's the swamp monster that's very easy. And there's a lot to laugh about in this project. It was, it's kind of funny when you dress up in a costume, but we had adult birds one time at one of our pen sites. They would come in and disturb they wanted the chicks, they wanted to be around the chicks, and they kept disturbing our training, so we couldn't get anything done with these adult birds there. So I thought, well, I'm gonna take a swamp monster costume and I'll go out in the marsh and I'll scare those birds away before the whole thing starts. So I go out there before sunrise, and I have this big, tarp underneath my costume so that other birds in the pen can't see it, and I find a little bush and I hunker down and I put the costume over my head and I'm waiting for the aircraft to show up. Now I realize, well, I'm down like this in the marsh and my knees are old, and first thing my butt is wet because now I'm over the boots. And then I realize I've just trapped about 9 million mosquitoes inside this little teepee tent. And I look up at my breathing hole, and there's another tornado of mosquitoes up there trying to get down in. So that lasted about 10 minutes before I said, that's enough of that, this is not working. So it's a process of learn by your mistakes. One day we were flying over Georgia, and I was watching the 4 birds on one wing and not the one bird, and I could feel his pulse running through my wing, and I couldn't figure out what it was. And then I looked over and realized that bird's flying along at 4,000 feet, and it's very bored, and it's just playing with the little batten straps. It's bored, looks like a worm. That's wild. At St. Mark's in Florida, we built a pen that's 4 acres. It had 2 freshwater ponds in it. It had a feeding station where we could feed the birds up here. When we first got there, we kept them in this little enclosed pen until the vets checked them all out and said they were good to go. And we put tracking devices on each one of them. And then they were let out, and they would forage in there, and there was crabs in the ponds, and they'd have a great time, crabs and shrimp. But they realized after a while it wasn't top-netted. So they would fly out into the marsh and learn to be wild birds. And then in the spring, or at evening, we would call them back into the pen using that vocalizer. They'd come in and land in the pen, and they were protected from alligators and bobcats that way, because it was protected by an electric fence. And so that's what we call a gentle release into the wild. They were slowly acclimated to the marsh and allowed to go. And that's also when they learned to thermal fly. Before, the only flight time they had was with us. But they would take off and they would feel the thermals, and they would just naturally do it. And they would climb up to 1,000 feet, then they would come down and land in the pen again. And then one day they'd climb up to 1,000 feet and they'd be gone. There was no bags to pack, no farewells, no goodbyes, they'd just leave. And a week or 2 later, they ended up in Wisconsin. It was an amazing transition into the wild. It worked really well. Oops. That's getting the birds used to that pen and used to eating natural foods. 2006, we had the first wild hatched chick in the continental U.S. since 1878. They actually tried one nest and were pushed off because of the black flies, so they found a new territory. The black fly season is very short, and so after that season's over, they found a new territory, re-nested, and produced 2 chicks. And it's very rare that they actually produce 2, but these guys did. And they both survived until fledge. People called this the first family. And when they were 80 days old, one of them was lost to a predator one night. But the other one hung around, and see, that chick is even bigger than its mother. And so they hung around until December. Oh, this is on our training site. We had the aircraft there, and we were working with a new group of birds when this older couple, the first family, brought the chicks over. Now those chicks had never seen an aircraft, never seen anybody in costume, never been on a cut grass runway before, yet they were totally content to follow their parents right by us. And we walked up, and fed with the puppets, and fed the parents, and fed the chicks, and it was amazing that you have this wild bird, but they're learning everything from the parent. And that goes back to they're attached neither wild nor tame. It's just all learning process. That photograph always reminds me of the cover of Abbey Road. Anyway, they hung around till the first snow in December, and then they took off and flew south, and we had them radio tracked, and they flew right over the pen on December 3rd in Florida. So we knew that we could teach them to migrate, and they would actually follow us, and they would teach their offspring the same thing. So it worked. It was validation. The following spring, the female of that first family was shot in Indiana. The kid who shot it wasn't a hunter. Hunters do amazing work, but this kid was just showing off to his girlfriend, shot it with a rifle after dark. He was caught and went to court, and he got a $1 fine. So we had $120,000 invested in that bird. It survived for 6 years, migrated back and forth to Florida, 12 times. Had its first chick, and then was shot by some person who didn't care very much, and he was convicted by a judge who didn't care very much. It's unbelievable, that attitude. He just couldn't believe that anybody would spend $100,000 on a bird. Why? And he couldn't believe that a kid's life should be ruined because he shot a bird. Big deal. So that's the issue. We've had 14 birds shot altogether. There's another non-migratory flock in Florida, and in Alabama, that started a couple of years ago, 2010, and they've had a real problem with shooting. Lots of birds are killed down there. It's just, I don't understand it, and I don't understand the court system that would give a person $1 fine to shoot a $100,000 bird. It's really unfortunate. We had a major kids program. We funded an organization called Journey North, which tracked the migration of whooping cranes and monarch butterflies and whales. And they prepared lessons plans for 1.6 million students that fit into the curriculum. So we had a really good connection with kids. They were a lot of fun, and we used to give presentations during the migration on the trips out at schools and churches. And so that study ended in 2015. We were still releasing birds for a couple of years, and then we closed down Operation Migration last year. It's time. We've reached our goal. We have 100 birds migrating in that flyway. They are breeding, not as well as we wished, but they are breeding. And I talk about conflicts with governments. We had a real problem with the Fish and Wildlife Service. They wouldn't admit that the black fly issue was the problem. Instead, they blamed it on our technique. They said when you hand rear a bird, it isn't equipped with the knowledge to raise its own offspring, so they're just abandoning those nests. So we went in that last year, 2 years ago, into the Sandhill study to see if you're going to see how whooping cranes are going to survive in an area, why don't you see how the sandhills are doing. So we went into the Sandhill study, and it turns out that the sandhills in that area are doing far worse than the whooping cranes were. So it had nothing to do with our technique. It had all to do with the fact that they wouldn't admit there were a problem with, they didn't want to deal with the problem of black flies. So that was the issue. So we closed down Operation Migration, and one of our supporters asked me if I would be the executive director of Wild Aid Canada. So Wild Aid Canada is based in Kelowna, BC. Charles Fipke is the person who started Wild Aid Canada. I'm not sure if you know that name. Fairly famous Canadian. Chuck is a exploration geologist. He spent his entire life he would go to Peru and he would make a bunch of money because he'd discover silver, and he'd come back and he would spend it all looking for diamonds in northern Canada. And he spent most of his life doing that, and then finally discovered them. And now Canada is the third largest producer of diamonds in the world. So he has a lot of money, and he wants to give back. One day when we were doing the whooping crane project, he phoned me up and asked if he could ride in the back seat. So I said, yeah, sure. And he said, I'll give you a donation. And he did. He was very generous and supported us. So that when I closed down Operation Migration, he asked me if I would be their executive director. So that only happened in April, and I'm looking for projects around. And one of them, I'm hoping, will be the Cochrane Ecological Institute. If we can get some movement with the government here, then we've agreed to build a facility to rear those, or to rehabilitate those grizzly bear cubs. One of the projects we support is called the Missoula Foundation, and this is in Indonesia. And it's an amazing story. Andrew Miner is a young diving expert, no degree in biology, and he was wandering through the Indian Ocean on his boat, and he wandered, the Indian Ocean, yes, and he wandered into Indonesia and discovered what he thought was a paradise. And it was just, the coral and the fish down there were mind-boggling, and nothing he'd ever seen before. But then he realized he was being raped by shark finners. And he found this little island, one of the very few islands that has a beach on it, and it was a shark finning base, and they were cutting the fins off sharks and using dynamite and using cyanide fishing techniques, and they were releasing the water from the local villages and destroying the environment. So we said, we've got to do something. So we talked to the local villages and got permission from them, and then he talked to the federal government and got permission to isolate 360,000 acres, and it's now a no-take zone. You can't fish in there at all. So he started working with the villages to develop a fishermen's cooperative, and they offered microloans to start other businesses. They hired most of the shark fishermen back as rangers. Now there's rangers that patrol the no-take zone. So he has 25 rangers, and 19 of them are ex-shark fishermen. He figured he had to pay for this somehow, so he got permission, got a 99-year lease on the island that the shark finners were using. He cleaned it all up, and he found all this teak wood, driftwood on the beach. So he and some friends bought a mill, and they cut the teak wood, and they built that, all those huts. They had the locals come in and do the thatch roofing. They got a cement mixer and did it all by hand. And so now they have this incredible diving facility where you can go and spend bags of money, and 85% of that money goes to support the Missoula Foundation. And so they're policing that acreage. And it's this was in 2005, and now all of the species have come back. This is just off the dock. Once a week they throw some food in when you're leaving, just so you can see these animals. It's amazing. There's black tip shark and grouper and red snapper there. And the oceanic manta rays are back. They have manta rays there with a 21-foot wingspan. It's just mind-boggling. And there's a place called the Magic Mountain, which comes to about 6 feet from the surface, and you can go diving there and see these manta ray. And they're doing DNA testing on them, and they're really trying to make a difference in that area. The United Nations is there, and they said that a football-sized field area of that habitat has 5 times the diversity of the entire Caribbean. And so every time you ask a story, there's or ask a question, there's another story about some environmental difference he's made. He had a problem with his garbage, and so did the villagers. They just throw it in the water. So he went to the Sarong, which is a town about 5 hours away by boat, and bought some land and built a recycling plant. And now they recycle 700 tons of plastic every year that was ocean-bound. So his supply boat comes in, drops off his supplies, goes to all the villages, buys up their garbage, takes it back to Sarong and recycles it, and then that whole business was given to the locals. So it's just a terrific story. They've done some marvelous work there. They're doing we just purchased a boat for them, a patrol boat, and we're buying 2 buildings for their patrol officers, one for accommodation and one for their base station. So that's just our most recent donation to them. And of course, we're hoping to work with the Cochrane Ecological Institute. As I mentioned, I'm got our fingers crossed that we can get some movement. There's no point in building a pen if we can't get bears. So anybody's got any ideas how we can move them a little bit, that would be great to hear. Our board of directors is basically 5, 6 businessmen in Canada, well-positioned and wealthy, and so I'm hoping that there's some connection between them and the oil industry that we can get to push the government towards allowing rehabilitation. And the other thing, of course, is whooping cranes. This is the Gulf Coast of Texas, where the only natural flock migrate, but they're starting to take over the Aransas National Wildlife Refuge and expanding. And so we just, this week, in fact, are hoping to close a deal to buy 1,093 acres of wetland habitat called the Mission River Flats, right in the critical area of habitat for whooping crane. So that's where we are now. This is my closing statement.
Woo!
Anyway, that's all I really have to say. Thank you very much for listening. I really appreciate this opportunity, and I hope to get to know a lot of you a little more about everybody's project, and maybe Wild Aid Canada can help. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Okay, tell me if it doesn't work, but I have to thank Joe, because it's wonderful of him to have come here, and it's wonderful of all of you to have come here, and it maybe is an indication that we can make a change. I mean, you're frustrated, Joe's frustrated, we really are frustrated, and the only way that we can bring about change is to push and push and push. And maybe, with a bit of luck, the provincial government will cut its people so much they'll get rid of the group that decides on the wildlife management bunch, because
attrition is our friend, right?
Yeah, attrition certainly is. So there's nobody there. That would be the best. Because the thing is, we did do it. We got the foxes back onto the prairies in Canada. Got the whooping cranes doing it, and we really, really hope to get the grizzly bears cubs reared and released. It's possible, it's done everywhere. And Alberta is the only jurisdiction in North America that bans the rescue of certain species, iconic species. So if you can all fight, and I'm sure you can, maybe we'll make a difference. We've proven that differences can be made. Thank you for coming.
All right, everyone, so we still have about 15 to 20 minutes for you to make some final bids on any items you've been having a heated bidding war with, perhaps. We thank you guys so much for coming, and we thank all of our volunteers who had put so much energy into this, specifically Patricia Thar, who has said she would be in here, but she's been busy out there volunteering, and Debbie Norman, who both have put countless hours into putting this together, and of course all of our volunteers who helped us today as well. And we thank you for showing up. Have a wonderful day and safe travels home.